Hey everyone, this is Justin at Level Up Lunch. If you have ever tried to set up a Java web project, you'll know the difficulties that go into it. Luckily, with Spring Boot, we get some convention over configuration, or what the Spring guys called an opinionated view on how a web project should be set up. Today we're going to walk through the Getting Started guide that's out on Spring's site. We'll go through a series of exercises just getting the project set up and then walking through a couple different scenarios. We won't go through all of them, and we'll also add how to configure it for a JSP. The first thing we'll want to do is set up a Spring Boot application. There's a few different ways you can go about doing this. You can use Maven, Gradle, or even download the source code that the guide provides. I went ahead and downloaded Spring STS and created the project through what they call a Spring Starter project. So if you click on Spring Starter project and select the web style, and that will create a base foundation project for you. It creates a couple different classes. One is the application class and the application test class. You'll notice in here, which might seem a little bit weird, is it creates a main method that some of us are not always familiar starting a web application this way. It's more around console apps. But what this does is it initiates all of the Spring Boot classes and gets things configured. And how that does that is it'll look at your class path, and it uses these annotations called conditional, and it'll see if those beans or classes are available on your class path. We're going to go ahead and run this, and we also added some source code to see which bean definitions or beans are available out there. So let's go ahead and get this fired up. We'll run as Java application, and we'll see in our console all of the different classes that are available to us. So if we scroll up, there's all these classes by default that it configures for us. Now this is kind of neat. If you've ever run with different application servers, new developers getting started have to configure all these settings and stuff. This is just right out of the box, right click, run, and get people focused on developing. For the next series of examples, we've created Eclipse snippets to help us along. Let's go ahead and create a hello controller. Create a new class, hello controller, and then we'll select and then insert our snippet. And this will show just how easy you can add a controller. This one is annotated with the new Spring 4 REST controller, and it has two request mappings. One is just to the default, and then the second one is JSON test. And you'll notice that it has an annotation response body, which gets delegated to Jackson to return JSON. So let's go ahead and restart our servers, and then navigate to HTTP, localhost 8080, and we should see a string response greeting from Level Up Lunch, which we did. The second one is JSON test, and we'll see a response of JSON, which contains a URL as specified. By default, Spring Boot doesn't configure JSP, and there's really 4 different steps that we need to take to get it configured correctly. Let's go ahead and create our controller, and we'll call it the JSP controller. And we'll finish creating that, and then we'll insert our snippet, and you'll see that it has a request mapping of JSP test, and then it returns a string which will get delegated to a file jsp-spring-boot. The second step is we want to create a application properties file. So we'll do other and then just do file, and then we'll do application.properties, and we'll finish that out, and we'll insert our snippet for application properties. If you configured Spring views before, the prefix and suffix should be pretty natural. And all that's saying is, based on the base root of where we're looking, what is the prefix of the file, and then look for the suffix. Okay? By default, Spring will look at the source main web app folder to look for your resources. There isn't a way to configure that in Spring Boot. And then the next thing we want to do is to create the actual JSP file. So we'll do other, and then we'll just type in JSP, and we'll create a JSP file. And we want to name that JSP-spring-boot.jsp, and we'll finish. We'll go ahead and select all of that, and then we'll insert a hello world, H1. So when the page gets returned, we'll see a hello world. And then the last thing we want to do is edit our POM file to include a couple extra dependencies. Now remember that when Spring Boot starts, it will scan the class path and determine which classes are available for it to auto-configure some of those dependencies. So we're going to go ahead and insert two different dependencies. One is the Jasper, the Tomcat embedded Jasper, and the second is the JavaX Servlet JSTL jar. So let's go ahead and save that. We'll restart our server, and then we will access JSP test, which should return hello world and render our JSP in Spring Boot. The last example we'll look at today is adding Spring Actuator into Spring Boot. Spring Actuator is a submodule that produces some of those non-functional metrics that you desire within your application. One thing to note is since Actuator is just a series of beans, it also can be set up outside of Boot in your traditional Spring application. So let's go ahead and add, in our POM file, we will open that up and then add the necessary POM entry for that to get started. It is the org Spring Framework Boot, and it's the Spring Boot Starter Actuator artifact. So if we go ahead and save our POM file, we'll go ahead and restart our server and then access a couple URLs that Spring Actuator offers. And the first one we want to look at is the beans. And beans simply returns all of the beans that are loaded within Spring context. There's also the other URLs that it provides info, which if you've configured info, it will return. If you want to see the health, there is the health OK, in case you have some ping service to determine that your app is up and running. And then there's dump as well, so which kind of just responds all of the different information about your application. These are just a few to name. Thanks for joining in today's Level Up Lunch.